Hey, Ellen, gentlemen, can you hear me? I think you guys are all muted if you want to unmute yourselves.
Yep, I'm here. Okay, great.
There you go. How you doing?
Okay.
Now, are we starting at 6:30 or are we starting at 7?
I thought we were starting at 6:30, but
That's what I thought. Okay.
Steve will probably be late. He gets caught in traffic.
Okay.
Hello, Bruce. Oh, I got a phony call coming in. I'll put me on mute.
Bruce, you're on mute. Can't hear you.
Mute.
Come now.
There you go.
There you go.
Woohoo! The sun's coming in right behind you. You're like,
Oh,
Oh, we got a presenter.
there we go.
Good evening, gentlemen.
Paul.
We can't
Paul.
see it, Paul.
Count your blessings.
There you go. Oh, well, we
You can see half of him. Hey, there he is.
That's better.
Be careful what you ask for.
Hey, if I haven't broken a camera in yet, you're not going to either. So
It's all good, I guess.
there you go. We lost Alan. Oh, there he is. Okay, I see how this works now. Okay.
Hey, we got people with
Al, you looking forward to getting back in the ballpark?
What?
You looking forward to getting back into the ballpark?
Me, May 11th. Yeah.
Remember the old days in the Britain?
I did 4 games during the spring in Florida, so I have been back in the ballpark.
Good. I remember the old days in the Britain. We had a hell of a time. My voice is still hoarse from a couple of those nights.
I can't talk. I can't shout at night at the ballpark.
He looks familiar, honey.
That's Deb's. Yeah.
Oh my gosh! Hi, Mr. Cohen. I went to school with Deb.
Hello.
Do you know who this is?
I'm your daughter, Deb. I'm her classmate, Molly. I was the one who played football.
Oh, okay.
I gotta do the litter bin. You're gonna have to tell Deb your chat.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a good 12 years I did it in that ballpark behind home plate. Had a great time. We actually got tickets for the Sunday before Memorial Day. We're looking forward to it.
The Sunday before, so that would be May 30th or May 23rd.
23rd.
I'm going to be there.
Good. It's a beautiful thing to have that thing open. Now if I recall right, Al, you worked with us in New Britain, right?
Yes, I did.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah.
I really feel like taking a picture of your Zoom meeting right now and sending it to Deb.
That's better. Stan popping in there.
Stand down.
I'm just gonna run that up to the litter bin.
Everybody's on time, I see.
Usually we have most of the people on time. I don't know. Well, that's still Rundy. Okay.
There's Joe.
Well, Bill, Bill's on his way back from the Zoom meeting in Cooperstown.
Oh. I was just there a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
Happened to run into Bruce Markison. It was a nice chat. There's Carl.
Hello.
Hello, Joe.
Hello.
How are you?
Good. Good.
There we go. Stan's finally popped up here.
Yep. Yep. I'll be right back. Guys.
You just came.
Shutting off outside.
Hey, Carl.
Guys.
And Mark. Hey, it's Mark, and it has his name and his face and everything.
Holy cow. You got to unmute your mic, Mark. Oh, there you go. You got it.
Yeah, my son figured it out. Thank you.
There you go. I just got some instruction myself. I'm not an expert, so.
Hey, Mark, how many Red Sox is DeGrom?
What's that?
I said, hey, Mark, how many Red Sox is DeGrom going to strike out tomorrow?
So I can only hear how many Red Sox. Well, I couldn't hear the rest of it.
How many Red Sox is DeGrom going to strike out tomorrow?
I'd say about 15.
That's where I'm at.
I mean, if they put Cordero in there, he's good for 3 or 4 strikeouts, 3 strikeouts for him, and 3. But Renfroe in, that's another 3. And all that's good for about 2 or 3 of them.
Where are they playing the game?
City Fields. There's some loud background noise.
I wonder if it's my furnace.
It's an echo. I can hear an echo
There's an
going on.
echo in your house.
I'm getting an echo too.
Well, it's probably haunted. Is it my furnace? Because I'll mute my mic if you want me to.
Sounds like
Oh,
a
shut up.
Ooh, there you go.
Oh, we're streaming live on Facebook, so the hackers can have that.
Right. So it must be you're hearing my furnace. It'll shut off in a minute. It's making hot water for my little girl for her shower. They're saying Worcester can open up with 25% next month.
Whisper.
The Worcester AAA, the Worcester Red Sox.
Ooh, sucks.
But that I'll tell you, all of that is subject to change. And I think change can be upward.
You're starting to
I would think so.
I'm through my sources, I hear.
Today.
Yes, John, we know you're well connected.
Okay, so who's our first speaker?
I'm sorry?
That first speaker.
That was Oxford. Oh, Steve's here.
Hey, Steve.
Hi, Steve.
He's coming. Oh, Lord. He's never looked better.
Steve, did you lose a bet?
Steve lost a bet and Tom got into a fight. Tom, what's the other guy look like?
No, Tom's supposed to be first.
What's that? Steve, you're mute. There we go.
My students gave this earlier today's. No, this is a birthday present from some of my students.
Is that an elephant?
Not sure what it is.
Hey, Steve, maybe they're trying to turn you into a Republican.
What's that, Joe?
They're trying to turn you into a Republican.
No.
No chance.
No chance.
Oh, Lord.
Well, maybe I'll take acting.
Or hold it, is that a flamingo?
It's a pink flamingo, yes.
Ah.
Yes, so.
That's beautiful.
Yes.
If you like it. So how's everybody functioning in math?
Hey,
What's that, Steve?
I've had my two shots.
Yeah.
Hey, me too.
I had my J&J, so I'm good.
Good.
Carl's not saying anything.
Echo. Can you guys hear that? Echo?
Yeah, it's like the
All right, so my furnace just shut off from Emma's shower. So did that help?
Hello?
It's not stopping the echo issue.
Still have an echo.
Not me.
with you, bro.
It's you know what? I caused trouble for how long in Britain? I may as well do it here.
Hey, Zach, what happened?
Happened to what?
What happened to you?
You.
What happened to you is that
Looks like his digital.
Rob.
Is anybody also watching on Facebook? Because you would get doubled up there.
Tom, say that again.
We're streaming to Facebook.
Oh.
And I didn't know if anybody was also watching there.
No.
We're streaming to Facebook.
So Mark, how's Robbie?
Doing good. How you doing, Steve? Happy birthday.
Oh, thank you.
19 again, huh, Steve?
Yeah. Hey, why not?
Good for you.
Hey, anybody want to do a meeting in like Elizabeth Park?
Yeah, why not?
Yeah, why not?
I mean, if it's a
If
typical
it's a typical sink,
we could probably do
we
it in
could
my
probably do it
backyard.
in my backyard.
Well, let's
take
offer.
This echo is really.
Yeah, we got to fix.
I'm hearing a delay. I'm hearing a delay on when people are talking. You start talking, and then a couple of seconds later, I hear it.
You're right. I'm going to suggest that we all mute our
computers.
Yeah, and Steve, you could just introduce the. I'm muting.
We want to get started.
For Bill.
I think we say 7 o'clock.
All's here.
Bruce, please mute yourself.
Still getting echoes, guys.
Not anymore, not for me.
Yeah, I got no echo.
Good.
Bruce is coming through at like 120 decibels, and I've got
How
my
about
volume
now?
turned down on my computer as low as it can go.
No,
How did
I'm
that get?
okay.
How did that get fixed?
So somebody on here is causing the echo. We could all.
Well, it stopped when Bruce muted his microphone, from my perspective.
Bruce, unmute yourself. Let's see if we get the echo again.
Okay.
Well,
How's this? Yep, we're getting an echo. When Bruce is.
yeah, it's Bruce's system.
It's a brand new system too. I could jump out and get my tablet.
You want to try that?
I can do that. Let me jump out and I'll get my tablet.
Okay, then we'll get started.
Ah.
Okay.
Carl, you want to do a Stratomatic day sometime soon? You got to unmute.
Yeah. Now that Bruce is off, you can unmute yourself.
Sorry about that, guys. I think that's a great idea. Do we want to go for that in June, or what do you know what? I wonder what the comfort level is going to be with the players, with the people who like to go to those. Will everybody be okay?
Steve's been shot. I've been shot.
Yeah.
So
We
have
know
I.
that Bruce has been
If
shot.
we could do it outside at somebody's house.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I think it's a good idea.
Okay. So, Joe, any
I mean, my house is available.
is it?
Okay. And you've done it at mine, so either or, it makes
Yeah.
no difference to me.
Well, either one works for me. Who did it last, Joe or Tommy?
I haven't done it for a while.
Oh, okay.
How about
We
you,
haven't
Alan?
had a strat get together since 2019.
That's right.
It's been a while.
Wow. Okay.
The last time we saw each other as a group was for a breakfast in February of 2020, as I recall, over at in Cromwell Diner.
That's right, Alan.
Yeah.
Right, you're right.
I couldn't make that one.
Okay, Bruce is coming back on, by the way.
Cool. And there's a picture of Bruce and Emma.
Do we know when Bill's joining us, or?
Haven't heard anything from Bill about that.
Because he sent me his presentation.
Okay.
But if we want to get started, Okay.
Paul, did you have slides that you might have sent to Tom?
He didn't
do.
send them to me, but I could give him access so he could show him himself if he wants.
Okay.
Yeah, I tweaked some of the slides earlier today just to kind of do some fine tuning. So I have it up and ready to go if you can share the screen.
I could do that for you. Hold on.
So do you want to get started, everybody?
Why not?
Okay, so hopefully we'll see Bill soon. Well, welcome everybody to this next virtual meeting. Good to see everybody. Maybe others will pop on later. So got two presentations for you, each about 45 minutes, including Q&A. And so Paul is the leadoff batter to talk about his book about baseball since expansion. And then Bill, when he's ready, will do his talk on Dick Stewart. And then if we have any chapter announcements to make, then we can do that a little later. So Paul, you're on. You're the leadoff batter.
Okay, thank you. And if Tom, if you could do the
You should have access to share.
Okay, and I'm just trying to find where I make that happen on my end.
You should have
Down
a
at
share
the
screen
bottom, there
icon on the
should be a
bottom.
share screen. Down at the bottom of your screen, Paul.
Yep.
So you click on there, that should, and that'll take you, and then
There you
you'll
go.
just have
There we
to
go.
find your slow. There you go.
Okay.
And
I'm gonna do this.
okay, great. Thank you so much. And I know we have some time constraints on this, and Bill has yet to join us. But if somebody could be the unofficial timekeeper here and just kind of give me the high sign if I tend to be running a little bit late. But I know
Steve, how long do we want to give him?
Till darkness.
Okay.
I have two skylights in the new house here, so that might be easy for me to keep track of. But I just want
I
to
think
start.
we want to give people 30 minutes and then 15 for Q&A.
Okay,
So,
that's fair.
Paul, you're on.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate that. This is one of those rare opportunities. I've told a couple people within the last few days that the title of the book was actually my suggestion. And for the authors in the crowd, usually that doesn't happen, that the author's suggestion actually becomes the title of the book, because they have some of the great marketing strategy behind the words that they're going to put on the cover. But in my case, as I was going through the book, doing the research, and I would come to these little nuggets along the way and find out about the increasing amount of attendance from the earliest days of real free agency in 1987 that basically went not quite, but almost on a straight line through the 1980s. The big gap, of course, was the strike year of 1981. But as I was doing further research, this little musical accompaniment happened to come into my head, and I thought, gee, this is really quite appropriate. So this will be familiar to many out here. This was the closing theme, of course, for the This Week in Baseball show hosted by Mel Allen many years ago. And the title of this song, written by a British composer named John Scott, was called Gathering Crowds. So I thought, well, how appropriate do we have increasing popularity in Major League Baseball, and we have kind of a soundtrack for that particular purpose. So it was kind of a nice little conflation of a few ideas. What I want to do with the presentation here is just basically take you through briefly chapter by chapter and give you a quick rundown. For those of you on Facebook, today Justin McGuire just posted brand new a podcast that he was very kind to do with me a couple weeks ago. And I mentioned to him that the official publication of the book was supposed to be April 28th and actually came out last week, but he posted that this morning, so the timing was perfect. He was very generous with his time and giving me almost a full hour of our discussion of where I went through the book. And I would encourage you to look at the Facebook Baseball Books webpage, Facebook page for information on that. And you can play the whole program through his link. I believe it's podcast number 304 as he keeps them cataloged. But I wanted to talk about the book in terms of very generally, the time frame that I'm covering is 1977, the first real year of baseball in the era of free agency. And I have kind of a convenient cutoff point with 1989 being the end of the decade. and as you'll see in one of the subsequent chapters, also the death of Bart Giamatti in September of 1989, and the coming on board of Fay Vincent as his replacement. Kind of an interesting bookends in the sad sense that we had the passing of a commissioner who really did love the game, probably loved the game more so than any commissioner that we have ever had. But it did seem sort of a morose bookend, but a somewhat convenient timeline way to end the particular book that I've got now before you. Going through chapter by chapter, I'm talking about in the first chapter, the fight over labor. It seems like you can't talk about baseball without discussing the labor issues that were always hampering the game in one form or another. And by the time we get to the early 1980s, we have Marvin Miller, of course, still the director of the Players Association, and he's won these great battles on behalf of the players. Getting true free agency is part of the landscape of the game. He has many foes along the way. I found this Sporting News cover quite interesting. I'm sure I received this because I know I was getting the Sporting News back then. I just didn't happen to remember this particular version, however. But Bowie Kuhn, of course, is sort of the man in the middle, Marvin Miller on one side, and in this instance, Ray Grebe, member, the head of the Players Relation Committee, representing the owners in all the negotiations. There was nearly a strike in 1980. It was averted literally at the last minute. They gave themselves sort of a truce, if you will, but delaying action for one more year didn't really solve the issue. And in early June of 1981, the players did indeed go on strike. And this was the first mid-season job action on behalf of the players. It lasted for roughly a third of the season. And then, of course, once the issue was solved, then everybody, all the players came back to great fanfare. They kicked things off with the All-Star game in Cleveland at the old Municipal Stadium. They tried to make up for lost ground by having the split season format with the first half and second half winners meeting in a divisional playoff or upfront divisional playoff before the actual championship series in both leagues. And of course, there were problems with that because the Reds and the Cardinals had the best composite records, both halves put together, but they were shut out of the playoffs just because of the agreement that was reached for have first and second half winners. So it was an imperfect system, but it was kind of an interesting way to get the game gin back up. But nonetheless, this is all part and parcel of the landscape of what's going on with baseball. And there would be subsequent job actions. Again, a very brief 2-day strike in the summer of 1985. And of course, beyond the scope of my book, but I give it a little bit of a mention, there's the really bad strike of 1994 that killed the interest for many fans. And it did, honestly, for myself too, that I stepped away and I never followed the game as closely as I did up to that particular point in time. But from 1977, from the onset of free agency, there's just a part of the landscape that you certainly can't get away from. And again, just simply titled this slide, "The Fight Over Labor." And almost hand in hand with that, with labor issues, of course, is the money that's involved. And we have revenue sharing keeps coming up as a recurrent theme that we want to prevent the rich teams like the Yankees and the Dodgers from running away and just spending their way to one pennant after another. And it's quite interesting that in the early years of free agency, of course, the Yankees and the Dodgers were the first two World Series participants, and the Yankees came out ahead to the delight of many in this audience. But with the signing of Reggie Jackson and Don Gullett, and we also had Tommy John later joining the Yankees. So the big money team in the Bronx certainly was holding forth. And out on the West Coast, we had the Dodgers pretty much going on their farm system, the products of their farm system. But over in the American League, near and dear to my heart, the California Angels, Gene Autry was freely spending on free agents that had kind of a mixed track record. But nonetheless, they finally won a divisional title for the first time in 1979 and again in 1982. So there was a little bit of a dividend that was reaped on the part of the Angels. But as I was discussing with Justin McGuire in the podcast, and just to give you a little bit of a preview if you wish to refer to that, what's quite interesting is the fact that once we get beyond 1981, after the Yankees and Dodgers meet in the World Series yet again, we have, there's really a direction change with regard to the small markets now starting to come to the fore. And we actually even see this a little bit in 1979 with the Orioles and the Pirates. in 1980 with the Royals and the Phillies. But then this continues forward through much of the 1980s, that you had teams like the Detroit Tigers, the Minnesota Twins get retooled, and they become a formidable team, even though it's a weak division in the AL West. Nonetheless, they have good players like Kirby Puckett and Gary Gaetti and Ken Herbeck. So they have those types of players that are shouldering the burden and making them competitive, despite all the outward appearances of Calvin Griffith being such a tight-fisted owner. He sells the team to Carl Pohlad, and all of a sudden this seems to sort of spur a rejuvenation in that particular franchise. So the money issues come hauntingly in the form of revenue sharing. The NFL was trying to bring this on board and doing so with some success. Baseball is much more reluctant to be able to embrace this particular income sharing philosophy. Obviously, teams like the Yankees that had a great attendance, they had good television packages. They had a lot of income at their disposal, and they were willing to spend it, much to the detriment of teams such as Kansas City or Minnesota or Pittsburgh that didn't have that big market that they could draw from. So there's a lot of contention that would take many, many years to finally get a resolution to. But again, I just kind of put it under a blanket sub-theme of revenue sharing. Also coming on board at this time were the superstations, WGN in Chicago, of course, WTBS with Ted Turner in Atlanta. These are really the forerunners of the superstations that are sending their games, their broadcast signals into markets that otherwise would not be able to pick them up. So there's a lot of contention among baseball owners who were very reluctant to allow this to happen. Gaylord Broadcasting in Texas was beaming their games throughout different parts of the Midwest, which was causing problems with, for example, the Kansas City Royals, who were complaining that people might want to be staying at home and watching the Texas Rangers instead of coming out to Royal Stadium to watch the Royals play. So this is an issue also that part and parcel with the money and the revenue sharing that was an issue that took quite some time to be resolved. And another subtopic that I deal with regard to money is, of course, the big collusion cases that we saw affecting the game in the mid-1980s. You had players like Andre Dawson and Kirk Gibson who were playing out their option. Lance Parrish was another big name that came to mind. And all of a sudden you have these really all-star top-flight players playing out their options and expecting to sign contracts for reasonably good money, just the same way that Joe Rudy and Reggie Jackson and the clack from the old Oakland Athletics had done. And they had certainly reaped a financial benefit. And then mysteriously, this market seems to be drying up, that you have really top flight players who are still pretty much in their prime, many years to go in their baseball careers, it would seem. And there's virtually little interest in their services. Andre Dawson finally hands a blank contract to the Chicago Cubs in 1987. He signs for, I forget what the amount was that they actually signed him for, but he won the National League MVP that year. Once the collusion had been settled, it ended up over time with interest and penalties and such. I believe it ended up costing the owners far in excess of what if clubs had just gone out and signed them to multi-million-dollar contracts in the first place. I think stretching well into the next century, into the 21st century, I think the total payout was something like in the order of $280 million, which for all the players involved at that time certainly would not have cost that much collectively, but it was a very hard lesson that was learned on the part of baseball. This particular chapter mentioning collusion, as I was doing the research up in Cooperstown, going through the Bowie-Kuhn papers, I found what I thought was a smoking gun, that Kuhn is chairing a particular meeting with an outside law firm. And even though the particular minutes of this meeting don't directly say collusion, the tone of the letter and the way the terms were couched really pretty much unquestionably points to that. And I do make reference to that in this particular chapter. It was quite an extraordinary find. And again, this meeting took place before he ultimately left office in 1984. But as I looked at that particular memo, it seemed to be the seeds, if you will, of what ultimately became collusion and the big penalty cases that sprung out of the Uberoth administration. I devote a chapter to what I call a tale of three commissioners, and then briefly touching on a fourth. Of course, Bowie-Kuhn came to power in early 1969, and he was finally ousted as a result pretty directly of his inaction in the players' strike of 1981. However, it's very difficult to find a replacement for him. and his contract is finally extended a couple times. And finally, Peter Ueberroth, who was chairing the Olympic Organizing Committee for the U.S. Olympic Committee and the Games in Los Angeles, California in 1984, he finally is able to come on board. Very interesting to run across a clip in the Sporting News in 1984, sometime in the spring, that I can picture his face, and I can't think of his name now. He was a columnist for Philadelphia, and he did the National League beat for the Sporting News. But he wrote a very he was serious, but I thought it was quite humorous column complaining that Peter Ueberroth should be stepping away from the Olympics now because the world of baseball has come calling for him. And it seemed pretty ludicrous to expect that after spending literally years of his life getting the Olympics organized, that Peter Ueberroth was going to step away on the eve of the Summer Olympics just opening. I found that quite amusing. But Ueberroth finally does take office in early October 1st of 1984. And he is immediately beset with issues, not least of which was Claire Smith getting accosted in the San Diego Padres clubhouse at Wrigley Field during the National League Championship Series. There's a big storm that brews over this. Of course, the last time some of us had been to the World Series club dinner back last February, I believe she touched on this a little bit. And of course, she gained a great deal of fame and notoriety because of that, and became fast and very, very close friends with Steve Garvey. And some of you may have remembered seeing Steve and also Claire at that dinner. So Ueberroth is strictly a businessman. He's pretty dispassionate about the game itself. He comes from a business background with the travel agency that he had opened, was successful in that business. It was, I believe, second in business travel only to American Express in handling corporate clients. So he's extremely successful. He turns a profit with the Los Angeles Olympics in 1984. The profits were plowed back into a project called LA 84, which provided access to a lot of good research material. I remember encountering that a couple of years ago as well. But his tenure is marked by having to deal with drug problems, as did Bowie Kuhn in 1984. Earlier up to that point, the notorious Kansas City Four. We'll get to that in just a little bit. But Peter Ueberroth, also being very marketing oriented, helps to bring on board a subject that we'll touch on in a chapter in just a couple of minutes with regard to the upsurge in marketing the game of baseball that also became his trademark during his administration. When he leaves office well ahead of schedule because he knew that he would not be able to gain enough support to have another term, National League President Bart Giamatti, who had segued from the presidency of Yale University, became president of the National League. He moves into the commissioner's chair, and in place of that, ironically, April 1st of 1989, and he's only there for basically 5.5 months or so. He passed away from a massive heart attack out of Martha's Vineyard shortly after the Pete Rose verdict, which I did not touch on that in this book. The backstory on that is that as I was writing the manuscript last year, I had intended to have the Pete Rose story and a couple other little odd instances that occurred during my particular time frame that I'm covering. I was 33,000 words over budget, and it was just easy to drop the last chapter, and I had to surgically remove some other parts of the book, which caused me great pain, but I knew I was overwriting the book in the first place, and I got caught for it. So the Pete Rose issue had to fall by the wayside, and I would have touched on it only tangentially. It's a fairly well-known story, but again, just quirk of circumstance that it happened to take place during the time frame of the book. But quite sad that Giamatti, who truly loved the game, very much a romantic about the game, ill-equipped, I think, to deal with labor issues. He did not have a good outcome with a labor situation in Yale during his presidency, and he was very hurt by that particular experience because he always considered himself very approachable, very personable, and the harshness and the nastiness of the labor issue down at Yale did not sit well with him, and he would have been very ill-equipped to go against somebody like a Marvin Miller or a Donald Fear representing the Players Association. I think that almost is a foregone conclusion that what would not have gone well for him. And upon his death, the then National League president, a close friend of Bart Giamatti, Fay Vincent, Waterbury, Connecticut's pride and joy, had segued to the National League presidency. And I'm sorry, not National League president. He was an assistant to Bart Giamatti, and he filled the shoes of Giamatti upon his death. in September of 1989. He immediately has to deal with a crisis in the World Series when, after just as Game 3 was about to begin, Candlestick Park is rocked by an earthquake, and he has to guide the game through its most recent crisis to that particular point in time. And Vincent, of course, did not cuddle favor with the owners either. It's just an unfortunate circumstance that the commissioners are hired by the owners and they're fired by the owners, basically, and it did not go too well for Vincent either. So, but again, that's a little bit beyond the time frame of the book itself. But nonetheless, I do give him a little bit of a mention because he came in at the tail end of 1989. One of the most unfortunate incidents of drug abuse, certainly as it pervaded Major League Baseball, was the unfortunate cocaine scandal that began to take place in the early 1980s. And we had the notorious incident of the Kansas City Four with Vita Blue, Willie Mays Aikens, Willie Wilson, and Jerry Martin. Prison sentences were commuted or reduced. And this is a very contentious point because, as I mentioned in the podcast also with Justin McGuire, it evolved into a situation where this was becoming so pandemic, if you will, in the game of baseball and other sports as well. To be fair about this, was not done in a vacuum with baseball alone. The Sporting News actually had sort of a catch-all miscellaneous column devoted to NFL football. They actually had a section that called the police blotter. Things got so bad that so many of these players were getting swept up in drug issues. The NBA was endemic in the NBA, NFL, college ranks were being affected by this. So baseball was not being in its own vacuum when all this was taking place. And of course, Keith Hernandez is out of uniform there in a shirt and tie as he's approaching the courthouse in Pittsburgh for his participation in the trial. The picture in the top right is Dwight Gooden. That's a little bit more current picture, but again, he's had several unfortunate relapses with drug issues, and very sad to see all this come into its state of affairs. But to his credit, Keith Hernandez did manage to straighten his life out. He was traded by the Cardinals to the Mets because the Cardinals wanted to rid themselves of these bad influences. Hernandez was in denial for quite some time. When he came to the Mets, he initially lived someplace in Connecticut. So I'm guessing he took a residence down in Greenwich, Connecticut. That was easy commute for him to get to Shea Stadium. But he did so on purpose because he did not want to have any temptations of what the city might have to offer in the negative sense. But he's drawn into the city through the good graces of Rusty Staub, who was back with the Mets again at that time, still running his restaurant. And he would invite Keith Hernandez and a couple other players to join him just doing deliveries around the city for the catering operation that his restaurant ran, and was able to show Keith and the other players some of the better sides of what New York had to offer. So this was a turning point for Hernandez. And of course, he became a very successful player with the Mets, and maybe not quite the Hall of Fame caliber player that was envisioned for him in the 1970s. And of course, he was a co-MVP in 1979. So he fell a little bit short there, but nonetheless, he did straighten his career around and became a very integral part of that great Mets team. So I deal with the pervasion of drugs, and I do touch on steroids toward the end. Again, I try to stick with the fairly strict time frame with regard to what I want to cover with the book. And 1989 was kind of a convenient endpoint again for me because of the end of the decade, but steroids are starting to take hold at that particular point in time, and we can see the outfall that is guys like Jose Canseco and Barry Bonds and the rest of them all start to build this incredible muscle mass, and then records start to really fall in earnest as we get into the 1990s. But that's the steroid issue has been ground well covered, but the roots of it were really in baseball really about this time. I devoted a chapter to take me out to what I call the newer ballpark. We had a lot of the old cookie cutter stadiums coming online in the 1960s. Shea Stadium, for example, Atlantic Full County Stadium, and we had Three Rivers and Riverfront Stadium, AstroTurf. We had players like Richie Hebner complaining about, I'm standing at home plate and I look out, I can't tell what ballpark I'm in. I don't know if I'm in St. Louis, Pittsburgh, or Cincinnati because they all look the same and they're basically all built the same. There's very little variation. Symmetrical fields, the outfield wall going from foul line to foul line that was basically all symmetrically curved. It was not a happy time. The game was tailored to be played in facilities like that, but as the great ballpark architect Janet Marie Smith said, these multi-purpose stadiums really were multi-purpose less because they did not suit the purpose of playing a good baseball game there, and they didn't serve the purposes for football either. But unfortunately, for better or worse, these were municipally financed stadiums, and the government wanted to get its best bang for the buck. So instead of building two stadiums to handle two sports, they were going to build one stadium to handle two sports. By the time we get to the 1980s, early 1980s, we have the opening of the Metrodome as a replacement for the old Metropolitan Stadium out in Bloomington, Minnesota. The Met is a little closer to downtown. If anybody here was at SABR back in 2012, I did take that tour that Brenda Himlick led down there. It was worth the price of admission, literally. I mean, we got to get on the field and we got a really great behind the scenes tour of the place. It was really quite astounding, but it was on the way out at that point. It was only being used for college baseball, and it was torn down shortly thereafter. But nonetheless, it's one of the newer ballparks, air supported structure, forced air. They tried to get away with not installing air conditioning initially, and that was a miserable failure. So air conditioning had to be quickly ramped up for the following season, 1983, its second year. But it became kind of known for its quirkiness of its own, an enclosed facility like that. Of course, we had the fans with the Homer hankies and the crowd roaring at over 120 decibels. So it was a great home field advantage that certainly played well for the Twins in 1987 because they won all their playoff games there, including the 4 World Series games in front of the home crowd. So that certainly had a great influence on the outcome of those games. But that's one of the newer ballparks. And again, a little bit of a change from the cookie cutter. We had the hefty bag out there in right field that got a reputation of its own. Also moving into the more modern era, we have the opening in 1989 of Skydome, which brought forth a lot of interesting amenities. A Hard Rock Cafe that was incorporated in the outfield section, as well as some suites, not all the rooms, but some suites of a hotel that also were out in that section. Again, this is really starting to cater to the modern sensibilities of the ultra modern fan. Not only do we have the restaurants and such, but we're incorporating different kind of amenities like a movable roof so we can at least open up and get fresh air. Very interesting. The opening day there was just plagued by horrific winds that kept swirling around the stadium. The weather was nice, but it was just so windy. It was really quite a detriment to the game. But nonetheless, they did have fresh air and sunshine at last, instead of being fully enclosed like a concrete dome, such as was played baseball being played out in the Kingdome out in Seattle.
Hey, Paul, I just wanted to give you a heads up. You got 5 minutes?
Oh, okay. Thanks. Thank you very much for that. Yep. And lastly, of course, Janet Marie Smith, the ballpark architect, coming in line with the design of Camden Oriole Park at Camden Yards. Her effort was very prime in making sure that the B&O warehouse, that beautiful brick warehouse, was not torn down, that was incorporated as part of the facilities actively used by the Oriole advocates. The team itself also has an office space in there, and of course, Boo Powell's barbecue out on Utah Street. So keeping some of the old city charm incorporated with a brand new ballpark that was tailored specifically to be able to have that old time flavor to it, like an Ebbets Field, if you will, that sort of an environment. I have a chapter that covers expansion, rumors of expansion and ownership changes. We had Charlie Finley's finally sold out from his interest with the Oakland A's. A lot of baseball owners were not happy, not sad to see him go. Bill Veeck divested himself of the White Sox, kind of a tortured relationship there, a real fan favorite, but nonetheless, the business aspect of the game really caught up with him, and he was not able to compete with the modern game, especially in financial terms. It always seemed like the San Francisco Giants were threatening to leave the Bay Area and get out of Candlestick Park, which was a dreadful place to play in. They were always rumored to be going to Tampa or perhaps New Orleans, some other favorable climate. And the Indians were also playing that card as well, just because they were domiciled in that dreadful municipal stadium, the Mistake by the Lake. And the cities that always seemed to be popping up in the newspaper accounts and the sporting news at that time, Marvin Davis always seemed to be buying or trying to buy one of these teams, notably the White Sox or the A's, and move them to Denver. Buffalo was long rumored to have interest in gaining a major league franchise. Louisville was drawing as a minor league AAA franchise for the St. Louis Cardinals. They seem to be drawing quite well, extraordinarily well. They had, I believe, like three quarters of a million fans. They were out drawing some major league teams, so they were drawing notice from Major League Baseball. And Tampa went ahead and built the, I think they call it the Suncoast Dome, I think, back at that time. But they built the stadium speculating that they would be able to eventually get a major league team to finally move there, which did happen, but not right away. I devoted a chapter to front office architects, 3 Hall of Famers. We had John Schuerholz, who was the architect not only behind the Kansas City Royals in the 1980s, but he also moved ahead to the Atlanta Braves in the 1990s and forged a real dynasty there in the American League West, all courtesy of his handiwork. Pat Gillick comes on board joins the Toronto Blue Jays, very integral, and by 1980, his farm system rooted deeply in the Dominican Republic and drawing new prospects to Toronto, very integral in making them a championship franchise. Division crown in 1985, they finally win back-to-back World Series in 1992 and 93. Whitey Herzog, of course, longtime baseball front office man. He's kind of the de facto general manager of the Cardinals. He's actually hired on as both the general manager and field manager, but he gives up those duties. However, he has very close relations with Joe McDonald, who was the title general manager. But without question, Herzog was able to initiate trades through McDonald to get players that he wanted that were going to perform well on the AstroTurf in the cookie cutter stadium that was Busch Stadium. And I also give a nod to Al Campanis. Despite the downfall in his reputation from the egregious interview that he gave to Nightline, where he was racially ignorant, shall we say, but we cannot ignore the work that he did with the Dodgers for so many years as the general manager and bringing their talent, cultivating it in the farm system and making the Dodgers such a long-running success that they enjoyed throughout the 70s and 1980s. Marketing the game, I'll touch on these very quickly. We have the coming of rotisserie league baseball. Even though it's no direct impact to Major League Baseball itself, it generates increasing interest in the game. The monopoly of Topps for producing bubblegum cards was finally broken in 1980. And beginning in 1981, we had new card companies such as Donruss and Fleer producing cards besides Topps. The top left-hand image there, that's a manifest from the Bowie-Kuhn papers. It's a list of licensees who were producing all kinds of products by the time Bowie-Kuhn was leaving office. Again, Peter Ueberroth expanded this even more. In 1982, there were 85 licensed vendors that produced all manner of household products and T-shirts and clothing, apparel, that sort of thing. By the time Ueberroth left office at the end of the 1980s, that had more than doubled. There's something like 180 producers that had been licensed to produce all kinds of merchandise. And what we also have charitable causes that the ball clubs got involved with. Around here, of course, we're very familiar with the Jimmy Fund, the Red Sox support for the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. And we also have Randy Hundley is the founding father in 1984. He created the baseball fantasy camp, which survives in many different forms today. Many other teams have gotten on board with introducing that concept to the fans with a lot of money to spend. And societal issues, again, race problems that seem to never go away. Again, Al Campanis with this dreadful interview with Ted Koppel on ABC Nightline supposed to commemorate Jackie Robinson's 40th anniversary of breaking the color barrier. Melissa Lutke across the top there, a reporter for Sports Illustrated, who had a controversy with getting access to the clubhouse during the 1977 and 1978 World Series as a credentialed reporter for Sports Illustrated. Claire Smith, the first female who was elected to the writers' wing of the Baseball Hall of Fame. And down across the bottom, we have Glenn Burke, the first gay player in Major League Baseball. His biography was recently released. Jim Eisenreich, overcoming Tourette's syndrome to have a very successful and lengthy Major League career, active participant with several World Series teams. And of course, Jim Abbott, born without a right hand, persisted, was a success in college and also with the California Angels, and also threw a no-hitter for the New York Yankees.
Okay,
that wraps
Paul.
it up. And
good timing.
okay. Just a quick shameless plug here. I did get the promotional code, which will give you a 30% discount off of the book if you visit Rowman.com. Rowman Littlefield is the publisher of this book. And with promotional code RLF and F30, you will get 30% off. And somebody posted on Facebook that they canceled their order, their pre-order with Amazon, and they jumped on and they could save a whole bunch of money by 30% off going through the publisher's website. So I'd be happy to entertain any questions. I guess we'll wait till, I'm not sure if Bill's with us, or if you want to jump into Q&A now, I'll let the moderator make that decision.
Paul, thank you for a nice presentation. Covered a lot of interesting things. So I think we got about 15 minutes for Q&A. Is Bill Ryzick here now? Hopefully he is. All right, so anybody want to ask Paul questions? There's certainly a lot of meat to chew on in terms of all the interesting things you covered. So please speak up, raise your hand or whatever, if anyone would like to, asks Paul something.
Paul,
Yes, sir.
yeah, just how influential do you see the rise of things like Bill James and the analytics in the 80s and 90s? I'm sitting here in my cave and I see baseball abstracts going back to 1982.
You're absolutely correct. And I have a presentation. I have another set of slides for a different presentation. And I actually found someplace online, I'm not sure if it was Amazon or a secondary book market, with a picture of his original abstracts, which I think were first self-published in 1977 or 1978.
They were run off on a Mimeo machine.
Yeah, he was doing that by himself, and then he was able to get a contract with, I believe it was Ballantine Books. I do touch on that in the marketing, because if I could just back up a slide or two, I guess I'm beyond that point. You may have noticed a copy of the Elias Baseball Analyst, which first came out in 1985, and there was also the Rotisserie League Handbook that was published also. I do touch on that because as more interest is generated by rotisserie baseball, it was my opinion that people became more interested in the statistical angle of it, because in particular with the Elias Analyst, you could look at a particular player and see that, and I'm just making this up just to give an example, you could look up and see that Carlton Fisk may have only hit like 138 against Scott McGregor. I'm just making that up, but just for the example. So if you have a rotisserie team and you've got a matchup perhaps of Carlton Fisk is in your lineup, but the opposing pitcher is Scott McGregor, you can pull Fisk out because you figure he's not going to hit that well against McGregor. You could get that deep into the statistics. So I did draw on that, and I do touch on the fact that Bill James is really starting to come into his own, and the birth of sabermetrics is really coming on board at this particular point in time.
Actually, I was in one of those rotisserie leagues. I don't know if anybody else was. And it was interesting and frustrating. Because all that mattered if you had a hitter was his home runs, batting average, RBI, and stolen bases. So, for example, the best hitter in the American League back in the 80s was a guy named Wade Boggs. But he helped you in only one category.
Correct.
And he played in a position where you expected to get more help out of home runs and RBIs.
And I think this is sort of an enlightening for a lot of people with regard to picking their own particular team. I gave a very simplistic example in the book that I was in what we just called it a home run pool, because that's all you were doing. You're just picking players based on the number of home runs that they would hit. Nothing more, no batting average, no RBIs, nothing. It was strictly by the number of home runs that your cumulative team hit. And obviously with the rotisserie league, as you mentioned, yeah, there's more detailed statistics in that. I did a particular league like that only for 1 year. There's very limited. There are only 4 guys in it, myself included. And I gave up after 1 year. The guy keeping the statistics, he was dumbfounded. He says, you can understand how I could have, relatively balanced picks throughout. I was in 4th place. I think I could have doubled my points. I still would have been hopelessly behind in 4th place. So I gave up at that point, just stuck with the home run. So
Yeah.
maybe it's just beginner's luck or what, but nonetheless, you're right. It could be a frustrating process.
Yeah. It was a whole different way of looking at baseball. Hello?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay, I lost my picture all of a sudden. Hang on. Nope.
Joe, you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, keep going.
Okay, I've lost the picture on my screen because I was looking up baseball statistics. But I did also make a screenshot of your of the book of your coupons so that I can try to make use of that.
Very good. Thank you.
Oh, Paul, I wanted to show everybody this, the hidden game of baseball, which my dad got from me as a present back in the 80s. And I think that's worth mentioning because Pete Palmer was sort of a friendly rival of Bill James in terms of different statistical models. And although I'm not a big fan of linear weights for a number of reasons, I think that relates to your point, Paul, about the rise of statistical analysis and looking at the game in different ways that hadn't happened before. And I think also related to what Joe started us on. I remember looking forward to getting the Bill James abstract because that was, to me, a sign that baseball was starting up again. So I wanted to make those points.
And points well made too, because even as I had written in my previous book, which dealt with 1968, 1969, even at that point, there are other people who had begun looking at baseball statistics in different ways and trying to make a discovery if there really was such a thing as a clutch hitter. So in a way, it's not really anything terribly new. However, by the time Bill James starts getting this abstract that his self-published, it really starts to get more into the mainstream. And I remember having the original copy of that book, the Hidden Book of Baseball that you have there with the red arrow graph going up. I had that on my bookshelf for quite some time. And I thought that I had mentioned it in this book, and it may have fallen by the wayside as I had to do some edits. But certainly that book coming out in 1984 helped to bring that concept and those different ways of looking at numbers in new ways to bring that into the mainstream even more.
Tom, we got time for a couple more questions. All right, anybody else, please speak up if anyone has questions.
And I was on mute. You got time. I'm sorry.
Okay, so anybody else, questions for Paul?
Any follow-up, anybody can send me email questions or message. I'm on Facebook quite a bit also, so feel free.
Sure.
Good idea.
If you're having issues getting the book, let me know. I'll get you the better price than you can pay $40 on Amazon. We can do better than that.
Good. All
All
right.
right, well, thank you, Steve. Thank you for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Paul. And are you still working on that project that you mentioned one of the last at the Naugatuck High School's baseball streak?
Yes, I'm mostly done with the narrative. There's a few miles to go on that. I'm working on pitcher acquisition, but I've written the count of the final game going after the 65th consecutive win, which did not happen. But it's been a fascinating project because I've had the opportunity to talk to several past players. Amazingly enough, I got a hold of the Shelton coach, who is still alive. He's 82 years young. He looks and sounds like he's about 50 years old. Just an incredible guy. So that's been a very rewarding project, and it was a lot of fun to put the narrative together, which I'm still working on, but that's probably about 90% done. There's a lot of work to do on it for formatting and such, but it will definitely get done. And it's been a very rewarding project and very different from anything that I've written up to this point in time. Getting into a lot of secondary sources with most books that I've done up to this point, but this one's really a whole different animal that speaking to so many people that had an active hand in either playing or have some connection with the team in one way or another. It's been very rewarding, very different type of research for me. I've really enjoyed it.
Oh, good. Thank you, Paul. All right, good. So it's good to hear from Paul. And next in the batting order is our own Bill Ryzick, who's talked to us about his book about Dick Stuart, whom a lot of you remember as Dr. Strangeglove. So, Bill, you're at bat.
Well, thank you. First of all, I think I was supposed to be batting leadoff, and I came on about 5 minutes to 7. You had already gotten started. I thought we started at 7. So if I was late, I apologize. But we
No,
can
you're
change
not
the
late.
batting
There
order.
was just a consensus to start. That's why that happened, not to exclude you in any way. So
I think a few people may have thought it was starting at 7 because we had, I don't know, maybe about 4 or 5 people join right after 7 o'clock. So,
Yeah. Well, I know if I'm running a program and the speaker doesn't show up, it makes me nervous. So sorry.
no, nothing to apologize for. Welcome, Bill. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank
Bill,
you.
you could just tell me when to flip pages.
Right now. I'm going to start this talk the same way I began the book, with Game 7 of the 1960 World Series. And that might seem a strange starting point for a biography of Dick Stuart because Stuart didn't play in that game. The reason I chose that game is because it sort of typifies the career of Dick Stuart. He wanted to be great. He came close to greatness, but he never quite made it. He was an egotist, a supreme egotist who just loved the limelight. And playing in a World Series with all of America watching was what he dreamed about his entire life. And what he really dreamed about his entire life was being the hero. And in the 1960 World Series, he flopped. The first 6 games, he had 3 singles and 20 times at bat, didn't field very well, which was not surprising for him. And he didn't start Game 7. And as we all know, the game was one of the greatest of all time. It's been described many times. We've talked about it at many meetings. In the bottom of the 9th inning, Bill Mazeroski was leading off, and Harvey Haddix was supposed to bat after Mazeroski. Danny Murtaugh told Stuart to go out and hit for Haddix. Stuart went out to the on-deck circle thinking he's going to win the game. At the bottom of the 9th inning, here's his chance to be the hero he'd always dreamed of. And we all know what happened. And Steve, I apologize for bringing this up again. I know it's a sore spot with you, but
Right.
We all know what happened. Stuart was left in the on-deck circle. Mazeroski became one of the greatest heroes in Pittsburgh history. And after the game was over, Stuart said, just half kiddingly, he said, people came to see me hit the home run, not you, Bill. But it was Mazeroski who hit it, and it was not Stuart. Stuart never became a superstar. He never became famous. He was notorious. He was well known, but he was never a real big star. And therefore, you ask, why would someone want to write a biography of Dick Stuart? And why would someone want to read a biography of Dick Stuart? Tom, if you go to the next slide. Who was Dr. Strangeglove? Well, he was a very good hitter. He could hit long home runs. He was known for the tape measure home run. And in 1956, he was probably the most famous minor leaguer player in America, because that year he hit 66 home runs for Lincoln of the Western League. He was better known than any other minor league player, and he was better known than a lot of major league players, which was due partly to his hitting and partly to his personality. He was also a terrible fielder, and we'd know him as Dr. Strangeglove, and he became a joke. And he was not bad in the same way other bad fielders were bad. Most players who don't feel well either deny they're that bad, or else they pledge to get better. Stuart did neither. He admitted he was bad. He joked about it, and he made no pretense of trying to get any better, other than occasionally. He always said that fielding was beneath him. So if you can hit like I can, you don't need to field. I'm there for my bat. He had an outrageous personality, a lot of which was an act. He was irreverent, he was witty, he made outrageous statements, and reporters loved him. Wherever he went, he was popular with the press. He was a womanizer, married 3 times, not a very good father, and in many ways, not a real admirable person, which I'll talk about later. You add all that up, and to me, that's a fairly interesting biographical subject. He was not a run-of-the-mill person. He was an unusual person, a notorious person, a flawed person, but a talented person. He was born too soon. He was a slugger who couldn't field, who played before the era of the designated hitter. He struck out a lot when strikeouts were considered a bad thing, unlike today. He was an egotistical self-promoter at a time when players were supposed to be modest and self-effacing. If he was playing today, he'd fit right in, and he'd probably be a very wealthy man, which he would have been very excited about because Dick Stuart loved money. He always talked about money. He always described himself in terms of money. He said, I'm a $50,000 ball player. I'm a $40,000 ball player, rather than what his attributes were. Dick was unusual in that he was in many ways more famous as a minor leaguer than he was as a major leaguer. He led the Pioneer League in home runs twice with Billings, separated by 2 years in the Army. And then in 1956, he became famous in Lincoln, Nebraska. It wasn't just that he hit 66 home runs, because other minor leaguers have hit more than 60 home runs in a season without being famous. Players like Bob Lennon, Moose Claybaugh, and no one ever heard of them. But when someone hits a lot of home runs like that, the press is curious. And they went out to Lincoln to find out who this guy Dick Stuart was. And when they got there, they liked what they found, because he talked and he talked and he talked and he bragged and he boasted and he made all kinds of claims. And the press just ate it up. So he got more publicity than any minor leaguer should ever get. They asked him whether he thought he could break the all-time record of 72 home runs. And most minor leaguers would have been modest and said, well, gee, I hope to, God willing, etc. Dick said he was going to do it and do it easily. He didn't, but he'd always make outrageous statements like that. Another thing that made him famous was he hit very long home runs. There was an interesting article by a man named Ernest Green on 60 home run hitters in the minor leagues, and most of them benefited from either short fences, high altitude, or prevailing winds, sometimes all 3. Sulphur Dell in Nashville was notorious as a home run haven. The fences were, I think, 258 feet in right field. Stuart didn't have really a lot of help from any of those, and he hit some long home runs. In those days, the tape measure home run rarely involved a tape measure. They estimated. They didn't have the methods they have today to measure home runs, which has cut out a lot of the 500-foot home runs. But in his day, they said he hit it 450 or 500 feet. That's when it went in the books. And supposedly he hit one over 600 feet in Pueblo, Colorado, which is a very high altitude. So a 600-foot home run and hitting 66 home runs and having outrageous personality leads to fame that most minor leaguers never dream of. Mark Harris wrote an article for Life magazine about him, which was a huge deal. Life wrote about the world's most famous people, the kings, presidents, famous actors, not Class A minor leaguers, but they wrote about Dick Stuart. He loved the attention because he was a classic self-centered narcissist. Tom, if you could push ahead here. Here's his Lincoln season. He was the classic narcissist. He was a tall, handsome guy who thought he was very handsome. And he brought a California sophistication and style to the bumpkins out in Lincoln. He would spend an inordinate amount of time in front of the mirror. Some of the reporters would clock him and see how many minutes he spent in front of the mirror combing his hair. He and Bo Bolensky were the champions. No matter how much money or how little money he made, he always drove a Cadillac. I interviewed Larry Gerlach, who some of you might know. Larry is famous for his work on umpires, and he's now a SABR legend, but in 1956, he was a teenager about to start his freshman year in high school in Lincoln. And he went to almost every Lincoln Chiefs game. He said he sometimes even paid, but most of the time he snuck in. And he said one day he and his friend were standing out in the parking lot, and Stuart comes screeching in his Cadillac, spewing up the gravel, and he got out, and he had this ducktail. He's a tall, good-looking guy with his ducktail haircut, clothes they'd never seen before in Lincoln. And he said, "My God, he was handsome. We just worshipped the guy." He was, and that's what Stuart wanted. He wanted to be admired. He would stand out. You know, people like Roger Maris hated notoriety. Maris would hide in the trainer's room. They didn't want to talk to the press. Stuart would stand out in front of the Hotel Cornhusker, hoping people would recognize him. If they didn't, he'd help them. You know, I'm Dick Stewart. I hit all his home runs. He was just always looking for attention. And after his big season, next slide, please, Tom. He was invited to the Pirates training camp. Not many people expected him to make the team. He expected to make the team. He had a big season after his 66 home runs. But as it turned out, 1957 would be a terrible year for him. In training camp, he was one of the most unusual rookies anybody had ever seen. Most rookies would do anything to make the team. Whatever they had to play, it'd work as hard as they had to work because they were so desperate to get big league money, big league attention. In those days, minor leaguers made almost nothing. But Stuart didn't seem to care. And that drove Bobby Bragan crazy because Bragan was an intense man. Most major league managers at that time were very intense. They were typical marginal player, would do anything to stay in the major leagues, thought anyone else should be desperate to get to the major leagues. Here he had this rookie who didn't care. He refused to practice fielding. He would just boast to the media, alienated his teammates, and really alienated Bragan. And Bragan said he was the god-awfulest fielder he'd ever seen. In those days, Stuart was an outfielder, and he was as bad in the outfield as he was at first base. He said he just couldn't put Stuart in the outfield. He'd alienate everyone. He took the number 66 as his own. Wherever he took the numbers 66, and he'd hang them up in any apartment he lived in, any home he lived in. And when the team bus, here he is as a rookie, they're traveling somewhere. At that time, they had Phillips 66 gas stations. And the bus would go by one, and Dick would say something like, "Well, they knew old Dick was coming. They put my sign out." And you can imagine what the veteran players and the managers and coaches thought about this rookie boasting about, you know, here I am, 66. So he was sent to Hollywood. The PCL was on a downward slide at that point, but it was still a big deal. Next slide, please. Be surprised by this next slide. PCL was still a big deal. And before that, it was almost the equivalent of a major league. And even in the 50s, it was still, a lot of the players could have been in the major leagues. A lot of them made a fair amount of money. And he played for Hollywood. Hollywood was Hollywood. There was more press there than there were in, certainly in Lincoln, Nebraska. And the reason I have a picture of Jane Mansfield there is not just to wake you up. There's a reason for it. And to show you how well-known Stuart was, he went to the 20th Century Fox movie lot, met Jane Mansfield, and she started teasing him, saying, you're getting your name in the papers more than I am. And his response was, "You're just not hitting the home runs, baby." And that's Dick Stewart. That was one of the stories that has prevailed. If you read the papers from Hollywood in that spring, you think Stewart was the only player in camp. They wrote about this guy, writer named Hank Hollingsworth, who wrote about him constantly. Every movie made, every quote, and there were plenty of them. He started out well, hit a few long home runs, but then he hit things that he always did. He struck out a lot, made errors, and he was over his head in the PCL. That was pretty evident. He may have been good in A ball, but he was over his head in the PCL. And in May, they sent him down to Atlanta. In Atlanta, it was more of the same. Strikeouts, errors, couldn't get along with the manager. Clyde King was his manager in Hollywood, and Clyde King was a pretty patient guy. He didn't have any clashes with Stewart, but he wasn't sad to get rid of him. Buddy Bates in Atlanta wanted to get rid of him. So he then ended up back in Lincoln, Nebraska. So here he is a year after hitting 66 home runs in Lincoln, Nebraska. He's back in Lincoln, Nebraska. And some people would have been humbled by that, but not Dick. Dick was the same, had to pretend he didn't care. First refused to report, then he went. And he hit 31 home runs in Lincoln and wound up with 45 home runs between the three teams. but he drove his manager crazy. Larry Shepard was the manager there, and Shepard was the manager who managed Stuart the best. He was the one Stuart said was his best manager. He had a lot of patience. One night, finally, Shepard had it. Harry Dunlap told me this story, and you remember Harry was a coach with the Kansas City Royals, a number of teams. At the time, he was a second string catcher for Lincoln. And he said one night he struck out, he threw the bat, he made some errors, he threw tantrums, and then one play, he dropped the throw to first base and just let it sit there. Didn't try to pick it up as a run scored. And he said Shepard jumped up so hard he hit his head on the roof of the dugout. And he yelled down the bullpen and said, "Dunlap, get in here." And he said, "You ever play first base before?" And Dunlap said, "In high school." So we'll get out there and play first base. So he took Stuart out in the middle of the inning, and Dunlap didn't have a first baseman's glove, so he had to use Stuart's. And Harry said, most people would have been humiliated to be pulled in the middle of an inning for bad play like that. So Dick just tossed me his glove and said, "Have a great game, Harry," because Dick Stuart always pretended that he didn't care. That was his persona, nonchalance, nothing bothered him. But he had hit bottom, and that did have an impact on him. And for him, he took it down a notch. And the next season, he went to Salt Lake City, hit 31 home runs in half a year, and was back in Pittsburgh. Next one, please, Tom. And he debuted with the Pirates in 1958. The Pirates, as most of you know, were a terrible team in the 1950s. In the first half of the 1950s, they finished last virtually every year. Branch Rickey was building up the team. They had players like Dick Grote, Vern Law, Bob Friend. They brought along as young players, but they got their brains beaten out for a number of years before they finally matured and became good. But 58 was the year. After finishing last in 57 and almost every other year, they came with a tremendous rush and finished second. And Stuart had a big role in that. He had 16 home runs in half a year. And the Pirate fans were just wild. To have a second place team after finishing last every year was like winning the pennant. They had a parade for them. And everybody said, "Oh, what if they had Stuart all year? They might have won the pennant." And boy, he had such a big contributor. But when the players divvied up the second place money, they gave him a lot less than everyone thought that he should get, which led to the stories that the other players didn't like him. And it's certainly believable that they did not. And there were a lot of stories going around that Stuart wasn't popular with his teammates. So I started to interview his old teammates. I interviewed players like Vern Law, Dick Grote, Dick Schofield, Bill Verdon, Bob Friend. And they all told me that Stuart was well liked. So I mentioned to Grote, and I'm going to quote from Dick Grote here. I mentioned to him that the press said that the players didn't like Stuart, and here's what he said. He said, "Believe it or not, Dick Stuart was loved by everyone in that Pirate club. I don't care what anybody says. Everybody in the Pirates loved him. Why it went the other way when he went to Boston and Philadelphia, I don't know, but we all thought the world of him. You knew what he was like, and we enjoyed him, even when he made fun of us. I liked him very, very much, and I think if you go back and talk to the Pirates, 90% of them would tell you the same thing. He was just a good guy. He loved to tease you, but he took it well when we teased him." And the other players said similar things. He was a good guy. We liked him, and which was very much at odds with what I had been reading. And a couple of the players, I mentioned it to them, like Bob Friend. I said, "But everyone said you didn't like Stuart." He said, "Oh, no, that wasn't true at all. We really liked him." And he said that whole second place money split was a misunderstanding. They fixed it, which they didn't. So here, what is the real story? And one possibility, of course, is people are reluctant to say bad things, one, after someone's dead, two, many years after the fact, and three, to somebody they don't know. But there's a second possibility, and that's the one I think is true. I think that when Stuart came up, he was brash, obnoxious, and they disliked him. And that's why they gave him less money in 1958. I think by around 1960, he had softened a little and started to, his humor was a little more self-deprecating, and he changed. He grew up a little, not a lot, but a little. And that was the Stuart they remember. And that's the one they liked. The one there was 2 or 3 years into his career at that point. By that time, some of his humor was tongue-in-cheek. Instead of just boasting, he would let everybody know he was kind of kidding. And that was the Dick Stuart that his teammates liked and appreciated. But despite the fact they liked him, he was always a loner. Everybody described him as, they said, "What was Dick like? Did you hang around with Dick?" I said, "No, nobody hung around with Dick. He was a loner. Whether he was chasing women, I think he was doing that somewhat, but he didn't really hang around with the other players. The 1960 Pirates were a legendarily close-knit team. Anybody you talked to who played with the Pirates said, we'd go out after a game and there were 6 guys having a beer together. Nobody ever went out in 1s and 2s. It was always a close-knit team. But Stuart was not part of that. He joked around with them in the locker room, but he was not part of the camaraderie. Next one, please. In 1961, the Pirates had a terrible year, but Stuart had a good year, the best year so far of his career. And you can see the stats, and he made the All-Star team for the first and only time in his career. They played 2 games in those days, and he played in both of them. Got a hit, pinch hit twice and got a hit. That was his best year. But in 1962, he had a very bad year. And if Stuart wasn't hitting home runs, he wasn't that valuable. He didn't have a high average in 62, and he wasn't a good fielder. He couldn't run the bases. So if Stuart wasn't hitting home runs, there wasn't a lot of value. And the Pirates also had Don Clendenin, who they thought could replace him. So after that season, next one, please, Tom. After that season, they traded him to the Red Sox. And that was a stroke of good fortune for him, primarily because he went from Forbes Field, which was a park that was way too big for him, just a bad park for home run hitters, to Fenway Park and the Green Monster, which was a wonderful place for a big right-handed power hitter. And Stuart had 2 great seasons in Boston. You can see the statistics on the screen. Hit 42 home runs in 63, led the American League with RBI, 33 and 114 the next year. But despite that, he didn't make the All-Star team either season. And when he didn't make it in 1963, it became a major brouhaha. Ralph Houck was the All-Star manager that year, responsible for choosing the reserves. And even though Stuart finished second in the player voting for first base, Houck chose Norm Seaburn instead. And Seaburn was not having a particularly good season. Stuart was. Some people thought that he chose Seaburn because they were old buddies from the Yankee organization. But in any event, Stuart didn't get chosen. At those days, Stuart had a television show on I think it was WBZ in Boston, called Stuart on Sports. And one night on the show, the week after the All-Stars were named and he was not, his guest, as a joke, gave him a picture of Ralph Houck, and Stuart tore it up on the air. Now, today, that would be no big deal because outrageous is normal. But in those days, to do something like that was just way over the top. And it made, again, national news, as Stuart had a propensity to do. And it became a running joke. Houck played along with the gag. They went on the banquet circuit and they joke about it. And Houck gave Stuart a picture of himself that was in a metal frame so Stuart couldn't rip it up. It became a joke between the two of them. Houck was a good sport about it. And he found Stuart amusing, but he didn't have to watch Stuart try to play first base for his team. Johnny Pesky did. And for 2 years, Johnny Pesky had a very difficult relationship with both Stuart and Carl Yastrzemski. And they ended up driving him out of Boston. What I found interesting, because when you can't get along with your 2 best hitters, it's a lot easier to find another manager than it is to replace a batting champion and an RBI leader. But what I found interesting is that after it was all over, Pesky seemed to dislike Yastrzemski a lot more than he disliked Stuart. Reporters would ask about Stuart, expecting to get an angry response, and Pesky would say something like, I kind of like the big lug. I don't know why. It's just not a mean bone in his body. He never talked behind my back. Yeah, he was infuriating. He was irritating, but I really can't like him. He's not a bad guy. He did not have good things to say about Yastrzemski. And when we think of Johnny Pesky, we always think of this kindly old man, because by the time he was in his 80s, 90s, you think of this nice old guy who went around telling stories and beloved by everyone. But when Johnny Pesky was a manager, he was a fiery guy. He's a little guy, a hard-nosed player. And a lot of people who played from that time said he was very difficult. He had a real temper, which he admitted. And he and Stuart clashed, he and Yastrzemski clashed, and Stuart was disrespectful. He'd tease him about how much money he made. He made more than Pesky, and he'd let him know, in your day, you could only hit singles. You could never hit the ball like me, Johnny. And Stuart was disrespectful, and Pesky went back at him. And they had 2 tough years together. And after it was over, Stuart said he would just kid around with him. He would, after Pesky got fired, he got a job as first base coach of the Pirates. And Stuart came up to him and said, Johnny, I made you what you are today, a coach. And even Pesky thought that was funny. And they'd banter back and forth. When a reporter called him right after Pesky got fired, Stuart answered, Johnny Pesky's residence. He was always saying things like that, and yet Pesky didn't dislike him. So after 2 years, despite his slugging, Stuart had worn out his welcome in Boston, could not be able to get along with Pesky, and he didn't get along with the players. He did not get along there as well as he did in Pittsburgh. A lot of players disliked him. Dick Raditz came out and said some pretty bad things about him. At first, they were joking around about him. There's the famous story where Stuart got pulled over by the police in early 1964 for driving with an expired registration. And he said, I had such a good year in 1963, I didn't want to jinx myself by changing it. They let him off. And that's when Raditz said, they've got a special plate coming up for you. It's called E3. And they go back and forth, but eventually Raditz did not take to Stuart. And a lot of the Red Sox players didn't like him. They just thought he didn't care. I interviewed a few, Ed Brassu and Felix Mantilla. He said the guy just didn't care. And we're out there trying to win, and he was just goofing around in the field. He had some spectacular fielding blunders that cost the Red Sox some games. So they had it with him. Supposedly Yawkey was the one who wanted traded. And it was difficult for the Red Sox to get rid of him. They were desperate to get rid of him, but everybody knew that. And all they could get in return was Dennis Bennett, who everyone knew had a bad arm and who was pretty much at the end of his effective big league career. And when you trade someone who hit 75 home runs, drove in 232 in 2 years for a sore arm pitcher, you know there's some flaw in them. And he reminded everybody all winter, I hit 75 home runs, drove in 232, every interview. How could you trade a guy who hit 75 home runs and drove in 232? He memorized his statistics. He knew everything. And in 65, Stuart had his last decent season. 64 was his last big year. He was 32 when the 65 season began, and that was approaching old age for a ball player. He didn't get along with Gene Mauch, and it would have been amazing if he did because Gene was so intense. And next one, please, Tom. And at the end of that year, the Phillies were so desperate to get rid of Stuart that they unloaded him to the Mets. Well, we already talked about John Pesky. I'm not sure what's in here, so let's do another one. There we go. The Phillies were so desperate to get rid of Stuart, they traded him for 3 minor leaguers, none of whom ever played in the major leagues again. And that was humiliating to him. For some of the big ego to be dumped for 3 minor leaguers, he was explaining it away all winter, how it really wasn't that bad because you'd have to pay $12,000 to draft somebody, so 3 times 12 was 36, and et cetera, et cetera. But that was the end of the line for him. He did not want to pinch hit. Western wanted to pinch hit. He wanted to play regularly, but that wasn't going to happen as long as that Kranepool was around, because Kranepool at that time was a 21-year-old bonus player who was going to play first base. Or somewhere, and Kranepool was going to be happy. Stuart only lasted half a season in New York and got released, which was another shock to him. For the first time in his career, he was unemployed. One of the reporters went to Connecticut. He lived in Greenwich at the time, and found him gardening. And he said, and Stuart said, I'm very good at gardening, like I am at everything else. And the reporter said something like, when you have 10 thumbs, at least one of them has to be green. But he went to the Dodgers, and he really found religion. Like so many players, they just learn how to do things right. What I said, they learn how to say hello when it's time to say goodbye. His attitude with the Dodgers was very good. Somebody left a sticker on his locker at the time that said, "We try harder." It was the Avis slogan. If you remember Avis from that time, they were the #2 company, car rental company. They said, "We try harder," and Stuart did. He really played all out for the Dodgers. Got a couple of key hits, helped them win the pennant, but then wound up in Japan for 2 years. And Japanese baseball was not a good fit for Dick Stewart. If you know anything about how the Japanese practice and train, it's killing. Vern Law coached over there, and he was giving some descriptions that players they're playing and working until they literally vomit. Stewart was a lackadaisical player. Nonchalant was his description of it. He was not going to fit in with Japanese baseball. He had 33 home runs the first year. Second year did not play so well and hated it. He left early. 69 was his last season in professional baseball. Went to spring training, made the Angels team. was released early in the season. He couldn't hit anymore. He struck out his last 6 times at bat in the major leagues, finished the season in Phoenix, but the minor leagues were not for him. Someone with his ego couldn't play in the minor leagues. In those days, the minor leagues had much smaller crowds than they do today, a couple thousand in AAA ball. That wasn't for him. Now, the rest of Stuart's life was pretty anticlimactic and sad in ways. He had jobs while he was playing. He worked for a stockbroker, but mostly he took people playing golf, took people out to play golf. He never really wanted to learn anything about the business. The same way he didn't want to learn about fielding. He just did not have a strong work ethic. So when he was 37 years old, he was out of baseball with no real job skills. He just wanted to lend his name to something and get paid for that. He knew somebody owned a brewery and said, I'll work for $500 a week. He said, what will you do? He said, I won't do anything. I just need the money. Needless to say, that didn't lead to a real good career. One thing he seemed to be capable of doing was television. During his career, he had TV shows in Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and he was glib. He was good in front of the camera, but he never was able to get a job in television. He was one of the candidates for the Red Sox analyst job one year, but Ken Harrelson beat him out. And that was ironic that Harrelson beat him out because Harrelson was so much like Stuart. He followed a few years later. They were both flamboyant, slugging first basemen who led the league in RBI while playing for the Red Sox. They were both known for their clothes, their attention to their wardrobes. Harrelson succeeded Stuart as the champion arm wrestler of baseball. They were both very good at sports like bowling and golf. Very similar, but apparently Harrelson had a work ethic where Stuart did not. And Harrelson was able to carve out a post-baseball career both as a short-term executive, but mostly in television. He spent his life working for a commercial collection company, doing marketing and sales. And I came across somebody, I just met him, who had said, what are you working on these days? A biography of Dick Stewart. Dick Stewart. He called on us when I was working for Cadbury Schweppes. And he described the meeting. He said, mostly Stewart talked about baseball, didn't seem to know much about the business. And he said he kept mispronouncing the name. He said, I really want to work with Cadbury. I said, no, it's Cadbury. He said, yeah, Cadbury. And he just couldn't get the name. And then he left to play golf. And he passed out pictures of himself, but really he just wanted to capitalize on his fame, which at that point, unless you were a certain age, there wasn't a lot of fame. And that's what he did for the rest of his life, which was difficult. And he went to some old timers games, did some card shows eventually. And Tom, if you can put the next one on, I want to say something about this picture, if it's the one I think it is. You there, Tom? Okay. I don't think that's Dick Stewart. I apologize. I got that on the internet and I said, I'm pretty sure that's him. But then I saw some later pictures of him and his family sent me. And I said, I don't think that's him. And it was a little too late to change it. So let's go back to the cover. Go slide number 1 if we could. But when Dick was late in life, he was living in California and he didn't have his family around him. He'd been divorced. He was estranged from his children. One of his daughters had died. Just was pretty much alone. So one of the things I wanted to do was find out what this guy was like and personally, what his family life was like. I wrote to his son, got no response. I don't know if I had the right address or not, but could not get a hold of anybody. The one person I was able to get a hold of was his brother's wife, Laurel Stewart. His brother has dementia and unfortunately was not able to help at all. But his wife was very helpful, talking about Dick's childhood, what his personal life was like, gave me some detail on his parents. But he said that his brother was Daryl. Said Daryl never met either one of Dick's children. And Daryl went to a game at one point. It's the first time the brothers had seen each other in 7 years. I do have some pictures of Daryl and Dick together later in life, but he was really estranged from his family. He was pretty much alone. He was a guy who was an egotist. And when the fame as it was went, it really had no one. Not much of a career. I don't know what he was like financially, but he became very secretive. He would never tell anybody where he was, what he was doing. And he always said, my ex-wives are chasing me. I think maybe he was afraid to find out that nobody really cared where he was or what he was doing. And he died in 2002 of cancer. And there's never been, I was surprised to find there had never been a biography written about him. I became interested in that when I was doing my Mets book and did some research on Dick. I remembered him, of course. This is a pretty interesting guy. And the more I got into it, and we've all become, I'm sure Paul will tell you that when you get into a subject, you become pretty biased in favor of it. I mean, I think Stuart's a really fascinating guy. Not a really highly intelligent guy, but interesting, not a star, but very interesting in so many ways. I mean, there's so many good quotes for Stuart, so many stories about Stuart, so many people who had stories about Stuart. The players I interviewed had interesting stories about Stuart. And one quick one that both Vern Law and Dick Groh told me, as that Stuart's playing, he would banter with the other team in the dugout. And in Dodger Stadium, the dugout was very close to first base. So all he did was banter back and forth. And Stuart was known for that. He'd be talking to people in the dugout, people in the stands, the ball would be hit, he'd get by him. So anyway, he's bantering with the Dodgers in the dugout. Gil Hodges hit a ball in the hole. Stuart thinks it's into left field, so he turns his back. Grote manages to get it, throws. Stuart's got his back to the play. The ball goes right past him. And they finally get out of the inning, they go to the dugout, and Grote said, so Stuart comes up to me in the dugout and says, error on the throw, E6. And Grote said, I just laughed because that was Dick Stewart. Anybody else, we would have been furious. But he just, he turned his back on the ball, blew the play, and came in and just teased Grote about it. And they all had stories like that about Stewart. And anyway, that in a nutshell is why I thought Dick Stewart was an interesting biographical subject and why I enjoyed writing the book. I learned a lot of stuff. So that's all I have to say, and take questions.
Bill, thank you. That was very good. And so let's get some discussion going. Questions, comments for Bill?
Bill?
Yeah.
Joe, go ahead.
Yeah, I turned this off because I was moving around in the room too much. I didn't want to be a distraction if anybody had it up.
This is Invisible Man. I can see your name.
I'm the Invisible Man, yes. The question I have is, Stuart was such a bad fielder, but the Red Sox had just had a really awful fielder in left field through 4 decades. The Reds, and when you looked around the Mets, come on, they'd survived Marv Throneberry.
Yeah, they did. What's interesting on Throneberry is that Stuart led his league in first baseman errors every year through 1964. And one year he and Throneberry led their respective. He and Throneberry tied in 1962. But what's interesting is Throneberry kind of he usurped his fame because Throneberry was making a mess in New York where Stuart was doing in Pittsburgh, and Throneberry had no desire to be famous. He just sort of fame found him. And you're right, they kept him around. And if he was a bad fielder, they probably could have lived with it, but he was a distraction, and I think if he had just promised to do better, they might have kept him around. And he did last from 1958 through 1969 in the majors, after a couple of years in Japan. So they did keep him around, but he was pretty bad. And you look at, he always led the league in errors, usually by a long margin. But if you look at the contemporary stats, he was just as bad. It's not like errors were a misleading indication of his ability. He was really bad. And I said he made it clear that he didn't care. He always had one story he'd tell, and he'd tell it many times. He'd substitute different names. But it was after he made a good stop of a ground ball. He said, wow, I must be slowing down. A couple of years ago, I could have gotten out of the way of that one. And he'd always make jokes about it. And what was strange about him is he could make a difficult play. He really had some skill, but he botched the easy ones. A lot of those concentration, the soft grounders that go through his legs. He turned the 3-6-3 double play, and then he'd just miss a pop-up because he wasn't paying attention.
Oh, man.
Bill, could you tell the story about his picking up the rapper in Fenway. And also when you showed the picture of the 58 Pirates, I didn't see Clemente there. And I'm wondering if you could comment about that and if there was any information in your research about how did he get along with, Latin and Black players in those days? Those two things, please, if you could.
Well, first of all, there were two stories that were always told about Stuart. One is he was cheered for catching a hot dog wrapper on the infield. The second was that Danny Murtaugh at one point heard the announcement that said, no one is to interfere with balls in play, and said, I hope the Stuart doesn't think that means him. Those two stories went the rounds many times. The second part was Clemente. Clemente was on the 58 team. He's clearly, I don't know. I'd have to look at the picture again, but he was clearly on the team. You know, possible he wasn't there when the photo was taken, but he was clearly on the team. As far as getting along with all the players, Stuart was not, it's kind of, he was a loner. I mean, Stuart was about himself. He didn't have, there's no incidents of him being racist or any of those things. He wasn't close to the Black and Latin players. But he wasn't close to most of the players. You know, nothing jumps out about that. Oh, Paul Hensler says he knows Clemente's absence too.
You qualified that with most of the players. So did he have some reasonably close friends among players?
I don't believe he did. I didn't find it. And, you know, I didn't talk to anybody who said they were close to him. And everybody I talked to said he did not have any close friends. He was just so into himself. I mean, nobody wanted to room with him after a while because he just talked about himself all the time. No, I don't think he was close to anyone. And, you know, after players retire, they often fall out of touch with their teammates because baseball is the link they have. They may not have a lot else in common, but he didn't seem to have kept in touch with anyone after baseball.
Other questions or comments? Bill, I'd like to ask, regarding what you shared about when he hit 66 home runs in Lincoln, did that help him in terms of, I don't know, for lack of better terms, the sociability and all that? Because I think you said earlier that he did sort of parlay that into wanting to be famous, but did he make any connections in terms of friends or others in that time in Lincoln in 56?
I don't believe he did. You know, he saw himself as heading for the major leagues in stardom. I don't think he made connections in Lincoln. He never went back there. He was renowned in Lincoln years after he left. You know, a few years later, people were still saying he's the most famous one ever to play in Lincoln. And I thought Bob Weirs was going to the University of Nebraska then.
Oh, yeah.
And Bob said, you know, that was just, the Chiefs were just a big deal. Stuart was a huge deal. He never went back to Lincoln afterwards. Pittsburgh was the city they loved him the most. That's where he went back looking for work. Boston, he was not as popular. Pittsburgh was the one they always wrote about in the press. Les Biederman, who is correspondent of the Sporting News and a local beat writer, always liked Stuart. Some of the writers thought he was brash, didn't like him. Biederman always found him funny. He would always tease him in his column. He said one time we were on a flight and he borrowed my typewriter to write some letters home. When he gave it back, I noticed the I key was worn out. And he teased Stuart about being an egotist and being stuck on himself and being a bad fielder. But you can tell he liked him. There was a sort of a soft spot in his heart for him. But Pittsburgh was the city that they always remembered him. Because, you know, I looked back and looked at the newspapers, just, you know, say, let's look at Boston papers after 1964. What did they say about him? Not nearly as much as Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh was the one city that they seem to remember him better. As the question came up on the screen there, let me. Let's see. From Bruce, this must have been a terribly difficult buyout to write if he was such a loner. Well, it was difficult to get to the real Dick Stuart. You had to make some suppositions. As far as his career, I mean, there's so much written about him that I was able to do that. And sometimes you learn about someone by what you don't find out. The fact that he doesn't have any close friends, that tells you something. What have you learned? He doesn't have close friends. As far as his personality, my thought is he was not a deep person. Everybody I talked to said he was very superficial. And it's feeling that, you get beneath the surface with Dick Stewart, you're not going to find a lot. He had that persona, and that's what I wrote. Said he put this persona out, a real macho, wisecracking, nonchalant guy who didn't care about anything. And that's what he wanted the world to see. That's what he put out there. There was probably a lot beneath that, but I don't think he would admit it. I don't think anybody ever saw it. So as far as a psychological study, it would have been very hard to write. A biography with the story of his life was not as difficult because there's so much out there about him, and I was able to track down enough people, certainly enough people who played with him. And unfortunately, two of the people that I interviewed have passed away since then. And one of them was a really good interview. And you probably know the name, Paul Pettit, the first $100,000 bonus player. Paul was a good guy. He just died within the last few months. But he played with Dick in Mexico, and he played with him in Hollywood, and he played with him in Salt Lake City. So he was a good source for those years. Harry Dunlap played with him, and Harry was a good source for his personality. He played with him in Lincoln. So I was able to find enough so that I think I was able to paint a decent picture of what he was like. And certainly his playing career there was a lot there.
Bill, if I may, some years ago at one of our meetings, Alan brought in Joe Christopher up from Maryland, and I'm wondering, were you able to reach Joe Christopher if they would, in terms of what he might have said about Stuart?
I did not try to reach Joe Christopher. I interviewed Joe when I did my book on the Mets, and we probably had a 2.5-hour interview.
Wow.
And Joe was all over the lot. Alan, you got to have several hours if you talk to Joe. And I figured that was 10 years ago. He probably hasn't gotten more succinct over the years. Two things. One, he did not play that long with Stuart. So I did not think he would necessarily be a real good source. And I said from my last interview with him, he was just all over the place. You try to get him focused on something and he'd be telling you about throwing the bat and swinging the bat and going north to south and east to west and all this stuff. And I did not think he'd be a real productive interview. I mean, Grote was a tremendous interview. Grote was Vern Law was really good. One of the things I learned from Vern Law is he had a torn rotator cuff that was cured by the Mormons laying on of the hands, which I'd never heard anywhere before. But the second time they tore it, I don't know if they had a limit of one blessing per lifetime, but they didn't do it the second time. And he was really good. He was very opinionated, and had a lot of good things to say, particularly about Japanese baseball as well, which I was able to use in the Stuart's time in Japan. And Rob Fitz's book were very helpful in terms of Japanese baseball as well. But Law, Dick Schofield I'd interviewed a couple times. Friend the same way. A friend that also has passed away. But Bob Friend was a really good guy. So I got, Verdon disappointing. Nice guy, but just didn't get much out of him, which was his reputation, kind of pass the turn. But anyway, that was my experience with interviewing. So no, I did not interview Joe Christopher, nor did I try to contact.
I'm wondering also if for Red Sox fans on the call who might remember Stuart from those days, are there any recollections from that perspective as a fan? Or if anyone else could speak to that?
The Red Sox had not yet saved me from a White Sox pennant, so I was not yet a Red Sox fan.
Oh, okay, that came later.
67.
Yes, understandable.
Yeah.
Just think, Steve, if it had been the Yankees, my American League team would be the Yankees. But it was
Too
the
bad.
Red Sox.
Oh, well. That would have been nice, Joe.
Anyway, okay.
Other questions or comments for Bill?
I'm going to ring off, so.
Now, before you do that, Joe, and before we wrap things up, you'd mentioned earlier about a gathering in Elizabeth Park and, subject to the COVID and all that, do we want to try to get together in person, or would you rather try to do something virtual?
I was just,
Yeah.
They removed the mask mandate for meeting outside.
Mm-hmm.
And most of us have had our shots.
Yeah.
So there's no real problem with our getting together. I mean, if you've got 10 or 12 people, you could meet inside. As long as
Yeah, we
they're
could
all
even
vaccinated.
we could even go to the pond house there and
Yeah.
out on the porch there for
That's
something
right.
to eat even.
Yeah. I do.
They only do breakfast there on Sundays, and it's packed.
Yeah.
So do you want to do that, everybody? Does that sound like something that might interest a lot of you?
Yeah.
Okay. And I'll toss out another suggestion, although I like what Joe is saying. We've had a couple of outings to Ryan's Deli in Vernon. That's near where Mark lives. Would that interest any of you?
Sure.
Sure.
I haven't had a tongue fresser in a long time, among other things. All right.
All right.
So I think that those are a couple of things we can do. And if you have other good ideas and about activities, we could do that. But let's first thank Bill as well as Paul for two good presentations. And
Yes.
thank you for moderating. And we can do this again too, if you like. And Stan, could you mention before we leave about the newsletter? You did send an email, but as long as you got an audience, could you please say something about that too? And unmute yourself.
Yep, there I am. Yeah, so I'm starting to pull together the newsletter. I'm hoping that by the end of May that I get any of the submissions that anyone wants to give me. I already have actually a number of things. Bill had given me something right after I had done the last newsletter. I have an extended interview with Ed Cranepool that someone sent in to me. Michael Frank has already sent in a couple things. And I'm going to be doing a book review on Bill Nolan's book on umpires.
Okay.
And I actually met with the person that runs the Chicago chapter's newsletter.
Okay.
They have a beautiful newsletter that they put out, and he gave me some suggestions on some of the stuff that he does. So I actually bought a publishing program, so I'm gonna try and snazz ours up a little bit more as well. So if it's not snazzed up for this one, it'll be for the winter one, but I'm aiming for this one.
Okay.
All right. So Stan, what's the deadline for wanting submissions?
I would say May 31st is my deadline.
Okay, good. Thank you, Stan.
Thank you.
Anybody have any other announcements or other things to mention before we adjourn?
Yeah, quick one from me. We do have the SABR books keep coming out, and I do want to show one to all of you that just came out.
Go ahead.
I think we could see it here. It's Jackie Robinson, Perspectives on 42.
Okay.
We have in here a number of essays. There is a bio of not only Jackie Robinson, but a bio of Rachel Robinson as well. It is an excellent story, and the usual team of great people, Len Levin, Carl Reichers, Bill Nowlin were involved in it. So it is great. And like all of our books, it's available at sabr.org.
Steve, if I could just speak to that book quickly. When that came
Please,
out,
go
Alan,
ahead.
I did download that, and I noticed that my colleague Dave Bomer contributed the essay on Ford Frick that was incorporated with that volume, and it's quite an interesting story. I'd encourage people to check out that one as well. The angle of Frick as the National League president kind of holding sway over approving Jackie Robinson's contract to play with the Dodgers. So he came up with a lot of good research in that. So I would encourage people to check that out as well.
Thank you, Paul. Bill, how would people get a hold of your book?
Well, it's not out yet. I'm still working on the proofs. It should come out around June, and you can get it either from McFarlandPub.com or Amazon.com. And when you start getting out, I'll be doing. In fact, the reason I'm wearing a tie, I actually did a talk on my 1960s book in person today to a Rotary Club in Winston, and going around doing the spiel, selling some books. So either McFarlandPub.com or Amazon.
Good. Well, congratulations, Bill, as well as Paul. Okay. Anybody else? Last call and for any things to raise before we adjourn. Okay. Well, thanks to our speakers, Tom, for moderating. And so look for information about those get-togethers as we talked about. Okay. And also send your items to Stan for the newsletter.
By the way, this will also be on the site's Facebook page.
What was that, Tom? I'm sorry.
This meeting is on the our site's Facebook page. I streamed it while I streamed the whole Zoom meeting over to the Smoky Joe Woods Facebook page. So it's out there if you want to watch it again.
Thanks very much. Good work.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye.
We'll be talking to you soon. Thank you.
Bye.